The carriage door slammed shut before Clara Whitmore could even step forward, and the wheels began turning against the gravel, leaving her standing alone in the cold outside the tall iron gates of Ashworth Hall. She stared at the retreating carriage lamps, her breath rising in pale clouds, her hands trembling not from the chill alone but from the sting of what had just happened. Her own family had left her behind. Inside that carriage sat her mother, her father, and her older sister Margaret, all dressed in fine silk and polished jewels, all bound for the same ballroom Clara had spent 3 weeks dreaming about. She had imagined candlelight, music, laughter, the soft swirl of gowns across a polished floor. She had imagined, just once, being seen. Instead, she stood on the frozen path in a gown that had been mended twice at the hem, watching the only transportation home disappear into the dark. It had started that afternoon, when her mother inspected her dress with a curled lip and said there simply was not enough room in the carriage for 4 people and their trunks of accessories. Margaret had laughed behind her fan, not bothering to hide her amusement. Her father had said nothing at all, which somehow hurt more than if he had agreed out loud. Clara had believed, foolishly, that they would send the carriage back for her once they arrived. She had waited by the gate for nearly an hour, watching other families arrive in their finery, feeling smaller with every passing carriage. Now the night had grown darker, and the temperature had dropped enough that her thin shawl offered little comfort. The estate loomed ahead of her, golden light spilling from every tall window, the faint sound of a string quartet drifting across the lawn. She could hear laughter, distant and warm, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who had never once been left standing in the cold. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and began walking, not toward the ballroom, but toward the road that led back to her family's modest townhouse nearly 2 miles away. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had never truly wanted to attend anyway, that balls were tiresome affairs full of empty conversation, and people who judged a woman's worth by the cut of her sleeves. But the lie did not comfort her, because deep down, she had wanted this night desperately. She had wanted, just once, to feel like she belonged somewhere. She had not gone far when she heard footsteps behind her, quick and purposeful, cutting through the quiet night air. She turned, startled, expecting perhaps a servant sent to scold her for lingering too long near the property. Instead, she found herself face to face with a tall man in a dark evening coat, his cravat slightly loosened, as though he had stepped outside for air rather than for any particular purpose. His expression was not one of judgment, but of genuine surprise. He asked if she was lost. Clara, embarrassed beyond words, tried to explain that she was simply on her way home, that there was no cause for concern, that he should return to his evening. But something in his gaze made her pause. He was not looking at her the way most gentlemen looked at a woman standing alone in the dark, with suspicion or dismissal. He looked at her as though she mattered enough to ask a second question. He asked her name. She hesitated before answering, aware of how strange the moment was. A stranger and a woman meeting on a cold road outside a grand estate. But something about his voice, steady and warm despite the chill in the air, made her answer honestly. "Clara Whitmore," she said. He introduced himself simply as Edmund, offering no title, no grand announcement of his standing, though something in his bearing suggested he was no ordinary guest at this ball. When she explained, reluctantly, that her family had left without her, his expression shifted from surprise to something closer to quiet anger, though it was not directed at her. He asked if she intended to walk the full 2 miles home in the dark, alone, in the cold. She admitted that she did. He shook his head slowly and said that was not going to happen, not on his account, not while there was a ballroom full of warmth and music only a short walk in the other direction. Clara protested. She reminded him that she had not been invited, that her presence at the ball would surely cause a stir, that she was not dressed appropriately for such an occasion. Edmund studied her for a long moment, taking in the mended hem, the simple shawl, the tired eyes that still held a flicker of pride despite everything. He told her that a gown did not determine whether someone belonged in a room. He told her that the people who judged her for something so trivial were not people worth impressing. She did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken to her with such quiet conviction before, certainly not about something as simple as her right to exist in a space others considered too fine for her. She found herself studying his face in the moonlight, searching for some sign of mockery, some hint that this was all an elaborate jest at her expense. She found none. He extended his arm, an invitation rather than a command, and asked if she would allow him to escort her back to the ballroom. Clara hesitated, torn between the humiliation of what had happened and the strange, unexpected kindness being offered to her now. She thought of her family inside, of Margaret's smug smile, of her mother's disapproving glance. She thought of walking home alone in the dark, arriving at an empty house with nothing to show for the evening but cold hands and a wounded heart. She took his arm. As they walked back toward the estate, Edmund asked her questions that no one had bothered to ask her in years. He asked what she enjoyed reading, whether she preferred the countryside or the city, what she thought of the recent unusually mild autumn weather. Simple questions, the kind exchanged between people who were genuinely curious about one another, not the kind exchanged to fill silence before moving on to more important company. Clara found herself answering more openly than she intended, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing with each step closer to the warm glow of the windows. When they reached the entrance, a footman moved to open the door, and Clara felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She was about to walk into a ballroom full of people who would recognize her plain gown, her lack of proper invitation, the absence of any family standing beside her to lend her credibility. She glanced up at Edmund, silently asking if this was truly wise. He simply nodded once, calm and unbothered, as though her presence beside him required no explanation at all. The moment they stepped through the doors, the warmth of the ballroom hit her first, a wave of heat and candlelight and the mingled scent of perfume and beeswax. The music swelled around them, violins weaving through the air in a graceful waltz. Clara's eyes darted across the crowded room, searching instinctively for her family, and she found them near the refreshment table, her mother mid-conversation with another matron, Margaret surrounded by a small cluster of admiring young gentlemen. She saw the exact moment her mother noticed her. The older woman's face went through several rapid transformations, confusion, then recognition, then something close to horror as she realized who stood beside her youngest daughter. Margaret's laughter died on her lips as her eyes landed on Clara, then on Edmund, then widened with a mixture of disbelief and something sharper, something Clara recognized instantly as jealousy. Whispers began rippling through the nearby guests, though Clara could not make out the exact words. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her, no longer invisible, no longer the overlooked daughter left standing outside in the cold. For the first time in longer than she could remember, people were looking at her, truly looking, and she did not know whether to feel triumphant or terrified. Edmund, seemingly unbothered by the attention, guided her gently toward the edge of the dance floor, away from the immediate cluster of curious onlookers. He asked, quietly enough that only she could hear, whether she would care to sit for a moment and catch her breath before anyone approached with questions she did not yet wish to answer. Clara nodded gratefully, and he found her a quiet spot near a tall window overlooking the darkened gardens, away from the worst of the crowd's attention. As she sat, trying to steady her racing heart, she watched her family from across the room. Her father had noticed her now as well, his expression unreadable, though he made no move to approach. Margaret whispered something to the young gentleman beside her, and Clara did not need to hear the words to know they were unkind. She had spent her whole life being the sister no one noticed, the daughter who faded into the background while Margaret commanded every room she entered. Tonight, for reasons she could not fully understand, that pattern had shifted, and she was not entirely certain the shift was welcome. Edmund returned a few minutes later with a glass of lemonade, which he offered without comment, simply understanding that she needed something to steady her hands. She accepted it gratefully, taking a small sip, grateful for the momentary distraction from the eyes still occasionally drifting her way. He sat beside her, not too close, giving her space to breathe, and asked if she felt any better now that the initial shock had passed. She admitted, quietly, that she did not know what to feel. Relief, certainly, at not having to walk home alone in the cold. Gratitude, for his unexpected kindness. But also fear, because she understood that whatever had just happened would not go unnoticed by her family, and there would be consequences waiting for her once the evening ended. Edmund listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, and when she finished speaking, he told her something that stayed with her long after the words had faded. He said that people who truly cared for someone did not abandon them outside in the cold over the cut of a dress. He said that whatever consequences awaited her at home were not a reflection of her worth, but of the smallness of the people around her. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome in such a public setting, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let anyone see her cry, least of all in front of the very family who had caused it. The orchestra shifted into a new piece, slower this time, the opening notes of a waltz drifting across the ballroom. Edmund rose from his seat and extended his hand toward her, a silent invitation. Clara looked up at him, startled, uncertain whether he meant what she thought he meant. He simply waited, his hand steady, his expression patient, giving her the choice rather than assuming her answer. She placed her hand in his. As he led her toward the center of the floor, she felt the weight of every gaze in the room settle upon them, felt the whispers grow louder, felt her sister's eyes burning into her back with an intensity that made her skin prickle. But for the first time that evening, she found she did not care. She was standing in the middle of a grand ballroom, about to dance with a man who had shown her more genuine kindness in 20 minutes than her own family had shown her in years. The music began, and Edmund's hand settled at her waist, guiding her into the steps of the waltz with an ease that suggested years of practice, though he adjusted his pace to match her own uncertain rhythm. Clara had learned the steps as a girl, but had rarely had occasion to practice them, and her movements felt stiff at first, hesitant. Edmund did not seem to mind, offering quiet encouragement, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the swell of the music. As they turned across the floor, Clara caught glimpses of the room spinning past her, the candlelight blurring into streaks of gold, the faces of strangers watching with open curiosity. She caught one clear glimpse of her mother's face, pale with what looked like genuine alarm, and another of Margaret, her expression twisted into something Clara had never seen directed at her before. Not indifference, not mild irritation, something closer to fear. She did not understand yet what any of it meant, why a single dance with a stranger had thrown her entire family into such visible distress. She only knew that for the length of one waltz, she felt weightless, free of the years of being overlooked, of being the daughter who did not matter enough to warrant a seat in the family carriage. She felt, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she belonged. When the music finally slowed and the dance came to its natural end, Edmund did not immediately release her hand. He looked down at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between curiosity and quiet admiration, and he asked if she would permit him the honor of introducing himself properly, not as a stranger she had met on a dark road, but as the man who intended to remain in her life a while longer if she would allow it. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs as she waited for him to continue, uncertain what such a statement could possibly mean, uncertain why a man of his obvious standing would take any interest in a woman her own family had left outside in the cold. But before he could say another word, she saw her mother pushing through the crowd toward them, her face a mask of forced pleasantness barely concealing the panic underneath, and Clara understood that whatever peace she had found in that single dance was about to be tested in ways she could not yet predict. Clara's mother arrived at their side with the practiced smile of a woman who had spent decades hiding her true feelings behind pleasant expressions. Lady Whitmore's eyes flicked between Clara and Edmund, calculating something Clara could not yet decipher, before she offered a small curtsy toward him, her voice honeyed with false warmth. She expressed her surprise at seeing her youngest daughter present, claiming there had been some confusion earlier regarding the carriage arrangements, a misunderstanding she would certainly address once they returned home. Edmund's expression remained polite but unreadable, though Clara noticed a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. He said, in a voice calm enough to sound courteous yet firm enough to leave no doubt of his meaning, that he was grateful the misunderstanding had been resolved, and that he hoped such confusion would not repeat itself in the future. Lady Whitmore's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, murmuring something about the difficulties of managing a household with limited means. Clara stood quietly through the exchange, feeling strangely detached from her own body, as though she were watching the scene unfold from a distance rather than living through it herself. She had spent years absorbing her mother's dismissals in silence, learning early that arguing only invited harsher treatment, but something had shifted tonight. She was standing beside a man who had spoken up for her without hesitation, and for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone in facing her family's coldness. Margaret approached moments later, her earlier laughter replaced by a tight, controlled smile that did not reach her eyes. She greeted Edmund with practiced charm, complimenting the ball, the music, the arrangement of the gardens, all while carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of Clara standing beside him. When she finally did turn her attention to her sister, her words were sweet on the surface but carried an unmistakable edge beneath them. She remarked that Clara must be terribly tired after her long walk, and perhaps it would be best if she retired early rather than overexert herself in company she was not accustomed to keeping. Clara felt her cheeks flush with humiliation at the implication, but before she could respond, Edmund spoke first. He said that he found Clara's company far from tiring, and that he intended to request another dance from her before the evening concluded, if she would consent to it. Margaret's smile tightened further, and Clara watched her sister's carefully constructed composure crack just slightly at the edges. The orchestra began a new piece, and Edmund excused himself briefly to greet another guest who had been waiting to speak with him, a gray-haired gentleman, who Clara later learned was a close friend of Edmund's late father. Before he stepped away, he leaned toward Clara and quietly told her that he would return shortly, and that she should not allow anyone to convince her she did not belong in that room. His words settled over her like a shield, giving her courage she had not felt in years. Left alone with her mother and sister for the first time that evening, Clara braced herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. Lady Whitmore's pleasant mask dropped the moment Edmund was out of earshot, replaced by a sharp, clipped tone Clara knew all too well. Her mother demanded to know how she had managed to arrive at the ball, who had brought her, and why she had thought it appropriate to appear uninvited in a gown so clearly unsuited for such distinguished company. Clara explained, as calmly as she could manage, that she had been walking home when a gentleman had found her on the road and insisted on escorting her back. She did not yet know his full title or standing, only that he had shown her more consideration in a single conversation than her family had shown her in years. Margaret scoffed audibly at this, muttering that Clara had likely thrown herself at the first man willing to offer her attention, desperate as she clearly was for any scrap of notice. The words stung more than Clara expected, cutting deep into old wounds she had carried since childhood, wounds formed from years of being compared unfavorably to her more polished, more confident sister. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the familiar weight of silence pressed down on her. The years of training that told her speaking up only made things worse. Still, something in her refused to fully retreat this time. She told her sister, quietly but clearly, that she had not asked for anyone's attention, that she had simply been left standing alone in the cold by the very people who were supposed to care for her. Margaret's expression flickered, something close to guilt passing briefly across her features before hardening back into irritation. Lady Whitmore, sensing the tension rising, quickly interjected, reminding both daughters in a low hiss that they were in public, surrounded by the very people whose opinions determined the family's future prospects, and that any further scene would reflect poorly on all of them. Clara swallowed her response, old habits reasserting themselves despite the small flicker of defiance still burning in her chest. Across the room, Edmund finished his conversation with the older gentleman and glanced back toward Clara, his eyes finding hers even amid the crowded ballroom. Something in his expression, a quiet reassurance, gave her the strength to hold her ground a moment longer. She excused herself from her mother and sister, claiming she needed a moment of fresh air, and made her way toward the terrace doors that led out into the moonlit gardens. The cool night air felt like relief against her flushed skin as she stepped outside, away from the noise and tension of the ballroom. She walked a short distance along the stone path, past neatly trimmed hedges and marble statues that gleamed pale in the moonlight, until she found a quiet bench overlooking a small fountain. She sat, allowing herself a moment to simply breathe, to process the whirlwind of emotions the evening had brought. She had not been sitting long when she heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path. She turned, expecting perhaps a servant or another guest seeking air, and found Edmund walking toward her, his coat now fully buttoned against the evening chill. He asked if he might join her, and she nodded, grateful for his company after the tension of her family's confrontation. He sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort but respectful of the distance between them, and asked gently what had happened after he stepped away. Clara hesitated, unwilling at first to burden him with the details of her family's cruelty, but something about his steady presence made her want to speak honestly rather than hide behind polite deflection. She told him, quietly, about the years of being overlooked, about Margaret's sharp words, about her mother's constant insistence that she was somehow less deserving of attention or care. Edmund listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail she shared. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the moonlit fountain before finally speaking. He told her that he understood, more than she might expect, what it felt like to be overlooked by one's own family. He explained that he had been a second son for most of his life, never expected to inherit the title or the estate, treated by many as an afterthought until circumstances beyond his control had changed everything. He spoke of his older brother, of the accident that had claimed his life 2 years prior, of the sudden weight of responsibility that had fallen onto Edmund's shoulders with little warning or preparation. He admitted that even now, some members of society still looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion, unable to fully accept that the overlooked second son had become the duke they now had to respect. Clara found herself listening with growing empathy, recognizing echoes of her own experience in his words, though their circumstances differed greatly. They sat together for a long while, the conversation drifting easily from one topic to another, no longer confined to the formal pleasantries expected of new acquaintances. Clara found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in longer than she could remember, surprised by how easily Edmund drew her out of her usual guarded silence. He asked about her interests, and she admitted, somewhat shyly, her love of reading, particularly novels that allowed her to imagine lives far different from her own restricted circumstances. Edmund confessed that he too found solace in books, particularly during the difficult months following his brother's death, when the weight of his new responsibilities had felt almost unbearable. They discovered a shared fondness for stories of adventure and travel, tales of distant lands neither of them had yet visited but both secretly longed to see. The conversation flowed easily, unhindered by the social pretenses that typically govern such interactions between strangers of different standing. As the evening wore on, Clara realized with some surprise that she had not thought once about returning to the ballroom, content instead to remain in the quiet garden with a man who made her feel, for the first time in years, genuinely valued. Edmund eventually suggested they return inside before her absence drew further unwanted attention from her family, though he seemed reluctant to end their conversation. As they walked back toward the terrace doors, Edmund paused just before reaching the entrance, turning to face her directly. He told her that he intended to call upon her family in the coming days, properly and formally, to request permission to continue their acquaintance. Clara's heart raced at the implication of his words, uncertain whether to feel hope or fear, knowing full well how her family, particularly Margaret, might react to such a development. She warned him gently that her family's reception of such a request might not be as welcoming as he hoped, given the tensions that had already surfaced that evening. Edmund's expression remained calm, almost amused, as he told her that he had faced far more difficult challenges than a disapproving family, and that he did not intend to be deterred so easily. His confidence, quiet but unwavering, gave Clara a flicker of hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. They returned to the ballroom just as the orchestra began another piece, and Edmund requested a second dance, exactly as he had promised earlier that evening. Clara accepted without hesitation this time, the earlier uncertainty replaced by something closer to genuine happiness. As they moved across the floor together, she caught sight of her family watching from the edges of the room, their expressions ranging from calculated concern to open irritation, but for the first time that night, their judgment failed to diminish her joy. The dance ended far too soon for Clara's liking, and as the evening drew toward its close, Edmund escorted her back toward her family, formally announcing his intention to call upon them within the week. Lady Whitmore's forced smile returned, though Clara could see the calculation working behind her mother's eyes, weighing the sudden shift in her youngest daughter's prospects against the carefully laid plans she had built around Margaret's future. As the family finally departed for home, crowded once again into the same carriage that had left Clara behind hours earlier, the atmosphere inside felt entirely different. Margaret sat in stiff, simmering silence, staring out the window into the darkness. Lady Whitmore attempted polite conversation about the evening's events, though her words felt hollow and forced. Clara's father remained silent throughout the ride, his expression unreadable, though Clara caught him glancing toward her once or twice with something she almost mistook for reconsideration. Clara stared out her own window, replaying the events of the evening in her mind, still hardly able to believe the transformation her night had taken. She had arrived at Ashworth Hall abandoned and humiliated, prepared to walk home alone in the cold, and she was returning with the promise of a duke's continued attention, a promise that had already begun to shift the delicate balance of power within her family. She did not yet know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay awake long after the household had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, replaying every moment of the ball in sharp, unforgiving detail. She had spent the better part of a year positioning herself carefully within society, attending every gathering, cultivating every connection, all with one clear goal in mind: securing the attention of Duke Edmund Ashworth before any other family managed to claim him first. She had believed herself close to success, certain that her charm and polish would eventually win his notice. Instead, her overlooked younger sister, dressed in a mended gown and abandoned outside the very ball Margaret had worked so hard to attend, had somehow captured the Duke's attention within a single evening. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, twisting into something darker than simple jealousy. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that Edmund's interest was surely temporary, a passing curiosity that would fade once he recognized Clara's unsuitability for a position of such consequence. By morning, Margaret had convinced herself that action was necessary rather than patience. She began quietly speaking to acquaintances within their social circle, carefully planting seeds of doubt about Clara's character. She suggested, with practiced subtlety, that Clara had somehow orchestrated the entire encounter, perhaps even arranging to be left behind deliberately in order to manufacture a chance meeting with the Duke. She implied that her sister was not the innocent, overlooked girl she appeared to be, but rather a calculating opportunist willing to use any means necessary to elevate her standing. The rumors spread quickly, as such things often did within their tightly connected social circles. By the time Clara ventured out for a simple errand 2 days after the ball, she noticed the subtle shift in how acquaintances regarded her, a coolness in their greetings, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near. She did not yet understand the source of this change, only that something had shifted in how the world perceived her. Clara mentioned the strange encounters to her mother that evening, hoping perhaps for some explanation or reassurance. Lady Whitmore's response was evasive, her eyes avoiding direct contact as she suggested that Clara was likely imagining slights that did not truly exist. Clara sensed the deflection but chose not to press further, uncertain whether pursuing the matter would bring clarity or simply more pain. Meanwhile, Edmund had not forgotten his promise. 3 days after the ball, his carriage arrived at the Whitmore residence, precisely as he had said it would. Lady Whitmore, upon receiving word of his arrival, threw the household into a flurry of hurried preparation, insisting that the drawing room be arranged perfectly, that tea be served with the finest china the family still possessed, that both daughters be presented in their most flattering attire despite the short notice. Clara felt her heart racing as she dressed for the visit, uncertain what to expect from this formal call. She had spent the days since the ball wondering whether their connection had been merely a product of that single unusual evening, whether the warmth she had felt in his presence would translate into anything lasting once ordinary daylight and social expectation returned to complicate matters. She reminded herself not to hope too deeply, protecting herself against the possibility of disappointment. When Edmund arrived, he was shown into the drawing room with all the formality the occasion demanded, though Clara noticed he seemed slightly uncomfortable with the elaborate fuss surrounding his visit. He greeted Lady Whitmore and Clara's father with polite courtesy, his eyes finding Clara's almost immediately despite the crowded room. Margaret entered moments later, dressed in one of her finest gowns, her smile bright and practiced as she took a seat near the Duke, clearly intent on reclaiming whatever ground she believed she had lost. The conversation that followed was stilted at first, weighed down by the careful formalities expected of such visits. Lady Whitmore steered the discussion toward topics she believed would flatter their family's standing, mentioning distant connections to minor nobility, exaggerating the family's modest fortunes with careful, practiced language. Edmund listened politely, but redirected the conversation whenever possible toward Clara, asking after her recent reading, recalling details of their garden conversation from the ball, with a warmth that made Lady Whitmore's careful composure falter slightly. Margaret attempted several times to insert herself more prominently into the exchange, offering opinions on topics she believed would highlight her own accomplishments, her knowledge of music, her familiarity with fashionable society. Edmund responded with polite courtesy each time, but his attention returned consistently to Clara, a pattern that grew increasingly difficult for Margaret to ignore. Clara, though grateful for his attention, felt the tension building in the room, aware of her sister's mounting frustration simmering just beneath her practiced smile. Toward the end of the visit, Edmund requested a private moment with Clara's father, a request that sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. Lady Whitmore's eyes widened slightly before she quickly ushered Margaret and Clara from the room, leaving the two men alone to speak privately. Clara waited anxiously in the hallway, her mind racing with possibilities, while Margaret paced nearby, her expression unreadable. The private conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes before Edmund emerged, his expression calm and satisfied, though he offered no immediate explanation of what had transpired. He requested a brief word with Clara before his departure, and Lady Whitmore, despite her obvious curiosity, granted them a few minutes alone in the garden just beyond the drawing room windows, positioned close enough to maintain propriety while allowing them a measure of privacy. Once outside, Edmund explained that he had asked her father's permission to continue courting her formally, an old-fashioned request he felt was proper given the circumstances of their unusual introduction. He told Clara that her father had granted his permission, though he noted, with some hesitation, that her father seemed burdened by concerns he had not fully voiced, concerns that Edmund suspected extended beyond simple parental caution. Clara felt a surge of happiness at his words, quickly followed by uncertainty as she considered what her father's hesitation might mean. She thanked Edmund for his patience and understanding, expressing her own hope that their connection might continue to grow despite the complications surrounding her family. Edmund reached for her hand gently, his expression sincere, and told her that whatever difficulties arose, he intended to remain steady in his intentions toward her. Before he departed, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had heard some unusual whispers circulating within society regarding the circumstances of their meeting at the ball. He assured her that he paid such gossip little mind, trusting his own judgment of her character over the idle speculation of others, but he wanted her to be aware that such talk existed, so she would not be caught unprepared should it reach her directly. Clara's stomach tightened at this revelation, though she thanked him for his honesty and his continued trust. After Edmund's departure, the household fell into a tense quiet. Lady Whitmore, having overheard enough of the garden conversation through the open window, cornered Clara in the hallway, her expression a complicated mixture of triumph and calculation. She spoke of the advantages such a connection might bring to the family, the elevated status, the improved prospects for Margaret's own eventual marriage should the family's standing rise through Clara's association with the Duke. Clara listened with growing discomfort, recognizing that her mother's sudden warmth toward her had little to do with genuine affection and everything to do with opportunity. Margaret, for her part, retreated to her room following Edmund's departure, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking once she was alone. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, searching for whatever flaw had caused the Duke to overlook her in favor of her plainer, quieter sister. She could not understand it, could not reconcile the sudden shift in her carefully planned future, and the confusion slowly hardened into something more dangerous, a determination to reclaim what she believed rightfully belonged to her. Over the following days, Margaret's whispered rumors grew bolder, spreading further through their social circle with each passing conversation. She began suggesting, in careful, deniable phrases, that Clara's modest upbringing made her fundamentally unsuited for the responsibilities of a duchess, that her family's financial struggles suggested motives beyond genuine affection, that the entire courtship had been calculated from the very beginning to secure the family's fortunes at Margaret's expense. Clara remained largely unaware of the extent of these rumors, though she noticed the growing coolness in social interactions whenever she ventured beyond the house. She mentioned her concerns to Edmund during a subsequent visit, and though he reassured her that such gossip meant little to him personally, she could sense a subtle awareness in his own manner, a slight increase in caution regarding public appearances together. One afternoon, while walking through the local market with a household servant for company, Clara overheard two women discussing her situation in hushed but audible tones. They spoke of her supposed scheming, her calculated abandonment at the ball designed to attract the Duke's sympathy, her family's desperate financial circumstances that surely motivated the entire affair. Clara felt her face flush with humiliation and anger as she realized the source of the whispers she had been noticing, though she could not yet identify who had started such vicious speculation. She returned home that evening deeply troubled, her earlier happiness clouded by the growing awareness that forces beyond her control were working to undermine the fragile connection she had built with Edmund. She confronted her mother directly, demanding to know if she had any knowledge of the rumors circulating through their social circle. Lady Whitmore's evasive response, coupled with a fleeting glance toward Margaret's closed bedroom door, told Clara everything she needed to know about the true source of the malicious gossip. That night, Clara lay awake for hours, torn between confronting her sister directly and simply enduring the situation in silence as she had done so many times before. She thought of Edmund's steady kindness, his willingness to stand beside her despite society's judgment, and she found herself unwilling to simply accept her sister's cruelty without challenge this time. She resolved, as sleep finally claimed her, that she would face Margaret directly the following morning, determined to understand why her own sister seemed intent on destroying the first genuine happiness she had found in years. Morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that matched Clara's mood as she made her way to Margaret's room, her earlier resolve steadying her nerves despite the familiar anxiety that always accompanied confrontations with her older sister. She knocked firmly, entering before Margaret could object, and found her sister seated at her dressing table, brush in hand, her expression immediately guarded upon seeing Clara's determined face. Clara did not waste time with pleasantries. She spoke directly, asking Margaret plainly whether she was responsible for the rumors circulating about her character, about the false accusations of scheming and manipulation that had begun poisoning her reputation within their social circle. Margaret's initial denial was quick and practiced, but the flicker of guilt in her eyes betrayed the truth before her words could fully convince anyone of her innocence. The conversation that followed grew heated quickly, years of buried resentment finally surfacing between the two sisters. Margaret accused Clara of stealing what she had worked so hard to earn, of using pity and circumstance to capture attention she did not deserve. Clara, in turn, reminded her sister of the years of dismissal and cruelty she had endured, of being left behind outside a ballroom in the cold simply because her family found her too plain to be worth the trouble of proper transportation. The argument ended without true resolution, both sisters retreating to their respective corners of resentment and hurt, but something had shifted between them nonetheless. Clara had, for the first time, spoken her truth aloud without flinching, without retreating into the practiced silence that had defined so much of her life. She did not know whether her words had reached Margaret in any meaningful way, but she felt a small measure of relief simply in having spoken them at all. News of the confrontation between the sisters reached Lady Whitmore within hours, carried by a housemaid who had overheard raised voices through the bedroom door. Rather than addressing the rumors Margaret had spread, Lady Whitmore's concern turned immediately toward damage control, worried that any further disruption within the household might reach Edmund's ears and jeopardize the advantageous connection Clara had unexpectedly secured. She summoned both daughters to the drawing room that evening, her expression stern despite the underlying anxiety Clara could detect beneath her composed exterior. Lady Whitmore spoke at length about family unity, about the importance of presenting a respectable front to society regardless of private disagreements, about the dangers of allowing personal grievances to threaten the family's improving prospects. She made no mention of Margaret's cruelty, no acknowledgement of the pain her rumors had caused, focusing instead entirely on the practical consequences should Edmund learn of the discord within their household. Clara listened with growing frustration, recognizing once again that her feelings mattered less than the family's reputation and advancement. In the days that followed, her father grew increasingly distant, retreating further into his study, avoiding conversation with any member of the household beyond what basic courtesy required. Clara noticed the change but attributed it initially to the general tension that had settled over the house since the ball. It was only later, through a conversation overheard by a loyal housemaid named Poppy, that Clara began to understand the deeper currents moving beneath the surface of her family's sudden interest in her courtship. Poppy had served the Whitmore household for several years, one of the few servants who had always shown Clara genuine kindness, rather than the careless indifference common among staff who took their cues from the family's own treatment of their youngest daughter. Late one evening, as Clara prepared for bed, Poppy knocked softly at her door, her expression troubled as she asked if she might speak privately. Poppy explained, in hushed and careful tones, that she had overheard a conversation between Clara's parents regarding the family's finances, a conversation far more dire than anything Clara had previously understood. Her father's business investments had suffered significant losses over the past 2 years, losses carefully concealed from the wider household and society alike. The family's debts had grown considerably, threatening not only their social standing but their very ability to maintain the household staff and property they currently possessed. Clara absorbed this information with growing dread, beginning to understand the true motivation behind her mother's sudden warmth, her father's uncharacteristic silence, even Margaret's desperate determination to secure a wealthy match of her own. The family's survival, quite literally, depended on a favorable marriage, and Clara's unexpected connection to Edmund had become far more than a simple romantic development. It had become the family's primary hope for financial salvation. This revelation cast Margaret's cruelty in a different, more complicated light. Her sister was not simply jealous of lost attention or wounded pride, but genuinely frightened of a future without security, without the comfortable position she had always assumed would be hers through marriage to a suitable gentleman. Clara felt a reluctant flicker of sympathy for her sister's desperation, even as she recognized that such fear did not excuse the cruelty Margaret had inflicted upon her. The following morning, Clara's mother approached her with an unusual proposition, one that made the family's true intentions unmistakably clear. She suggested that Clara might consider accepting the attentions of a local gentleman, a Mr. Silas Grant, a man of modest but stable means who had recently expressed interest in courting her. Lady Whitmore framed the suggestion as a practical backup arrangement, should Edmund's attentions prove fleeting or unreliable, though Clara understood immediately that the true purpose was to secure some measure of financial stability regardless of how her connection to the Duke ultimately resolved. Clara refused outright, explaining that she had no interest in Mr. Grant, that her affections were genuinely engaged elsewhere, and that she would not be treated as a mere insurance policy against her family's financial mismanagement. Lady Whitmore's response was sharp and immediate, reminding Clara of her duty to the family, of the sacrifices her parents had made throughout her life, of the ingratitude such refusal represented given everything the family had supposedly provided for her. The argument escalated quickly, years of accumulated resentment finally surfacing on both sides. Clara reminded her mother, with a boldness that surprised even herself, of the years of neglect and dismissal she had endured, of being left behind at the very ball where her family now hoped to profit from her unexpected good fortune. Lady Whitmore, stunned by her usually quiet daughter's sudden defiance, resorted to threats, declaring that Clara would be confined to the house, her correspondence monitored, her movements restricted until she agreed to at least consider Mr. Grant's suit as a reasonable precaution. True to her word, Lady Whitmore implemented strict new rules within days. Clara found herself effectively confined to the family home, forbidden from venturing out without direct supervision, her letters checked before being sent or received. When Edmund's carriage arrived for a planned visit later that week, Lady Whitmore intercepted him at the door, offering vague excuses about Clara's sudden illness, her need for rest and quiet, apologies wrapped in careful, practiced concern that masked the true situation entirely. Clara, confined to her room during Edmund's visit, could hear the muffled conversation from below, unable to intervene or explain the truth of her circumstances. She felt a growing desperation as the days passed, each one bringing new restrictions, new pressure from her mother regarding Mr. Grant's suitability, new silence from her father who seemed unwilling or unable to intervene on her behalf despite his earlier apparent approval of Edmund's courtship. Mr. Grant himself began calling upon the household with increasing frequency, encouraged openly by Lady Whitmore despite Clara's repeated, clear refusals of his attentions. He was a pleasant enough gentleman in manner, though entirely unremarkable in conversation, his primary appeal lying in his modest but stable income, rather than any genuine connection between them. Clara endured these visits with strained politeness, aware that any outright rudeness would only invite further consequences from her increasingly desperate mother. Throughout this period of confinement, Poppy remained Clara's only source of comfort and information from the outside world. The loyal housemaid brought whispered updates whenever possible, mentioning that Edmund had called upon the household multiple times, each visit met with increasingly elaborate excuses regarding Clara's unavailability. Poppy also mentioned, with visible concern, that talk had begun circulating regarding Clara's sudden and unexplained absence from social gatherings, speculation that ranged from illness to scandal, to the possibility that the Duke had already lost interest and moved on to other prospects. Clara grew increasingly desperate as the days stretched into a full week of confinement, her hope dimming with each passing hour that Edmund might simply accept the excuses offered and quietly withdraw his interest rather than face the mounting obstacles her family had placed between them. She spent long hours in her room, unable to write freely, unable to explain her circumstances to the one person who had shown her genuine kindness and understanding. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She approached Poppy late one evening, asking if she would be willing to carry a letter directly to Edmund, bypassing the household's monitoring entirely. Poppy hesitated only briefly, aware of the risk to her own position should the deception be discovered, before agreeing to help, moved by genuine sympathy for the young woman she had watched grow up largely unloved within her own family. Clara spent hours crafting the letter carefully, explaining the truth of her confinement, the pressure to accept Mr. Grant's suit, her family's dire financial circumstances that had transformed her courtship into a calculated strategy for survival. She wrote of her genuine feelings for Edmund, feelings that had nothing to do with her family's desperate scheming, and expressed her fear that he might have already been deceived into believing she had lost interest or fallen ill beyond recovery. Poppy delivered the letter the following morning, disguised within a basket of goods meant for the local market, timing her errand to coincide with Edmund's known schedule of morning rides through the nearby countryside. She managed to pass the letter to one of his household staff without drawing suspicion, trusting that it would reach him swiftly given the urgency Clara had impressed upon her. Edmund received the letter that same afternoon, his expression shifting from confusion to growing anger as he read through Clara's careful, urgent words. He had indeed grown increasingly suspicious over the past week, sensing that Lady Whitmore's excuses lacked genuine substance, though he had not wanted to overstep propriety by pressing the matter too forcefully without clear evidence of wrongdoing. Now, with Clara's own words confirming his suspicions, he felt a fierce protectiveness rising within him, coupled with genuine outrage at the treatment she had been enduring. He immediately summoned his carriage, his mind already working through the proper course of action, understanding that a direct and public confrontation would be necessary to break through the barriers her family had constructed. He knew such action would defy typical social propriety, that arriving unannounced and demanding to see Clara might invite scandal and gossip of its own, but he found himself unwilling to allow careful adherence to social convention, to prevent him from protecting someone whose well-being had come to matter deeply to him in the short weeks since their unusual first meeting. As his carriage began the journey toward the Whitmore residence, Edmund reflected on how quickly his feelings for Clara had grown from simple curiosity into something far more significant. He thought of her quiet strength that first night, standing alone outside the ballroom despite her humiliation, refusing to fully collapse under the weight of her family's cruelty. He thought of their conversation in the garden, the ease with which they had shared their respective experiences of being overlooked, of finding unexpected common ground despite their vastly different circumstances. He understood now, with growing clarity, that his connection to Clara was not simply the passing curiosity he might have once assumed, but something far deeper, a genuine partnership he had not expected to find so unexpectedly. The thought of her suffering under her family's manipulation, confined and pressured toward a match she did not want, filled him with a determination that hardened into resolve as his carriage drew closer to the Whitmore estate, the wheels turning steadily against the road as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. The Whitmore household was settling into its usual evening quiet when the sound of an approaching carriage disrupted the calm. Lady Whitmore, seated in the drawing room reviewing household accounts with a troubled expression, glanced up sharply at the sound of hooves on gravel, followed almost immediately by an insistent knock at the front door. She rose quickly, smoothing her skirts, already composing the excuses she assumed she would need for whatever unexpected visitor had arrived at such an hour. When the footman announced Duke Edmund Ashworth, Lady Whitmore's composure faltered visibly. She had not expected him to call again so soon after her latest excuse regarding Clara's continued indisposition, and certainly not without prior notice or invitation. She hurried to the entrance herself, intercepting him before he could proceed further into the house, her voice pitched with forced pleasantness that did little to mask her obvious alarm. Edmund did not return her greeting with the usual polite formalities. His expression was calm but unmistakably firm as he informed her that he had received a letter from Clara, detailing her circumstances, and that he had come to see for himself the truth of her situation. Lady Whitmore's face paled as she attempted to deflect, insisting once again that Clara remained unwell, that visitors would only worsen her condition, that propriety demanded he wait until she had sufficiently recovered before calling again. Edmund's response left no room for further evasion. He stated plainly that he intended to see Clara immediately, and that he was prepared to remain at the residence until such a meeting was arranged, regardless of how long that required. His tone, though not raised, carried an unmistakable authority that made clear the futility of further deception. Lady Whitmore, recognizing the impossibility of continuing her fabrications in the face of his determination, retreated into flustered silence, uncertain how to proceed without revealing the full extent of the household's manipulation. The commotion at the front entrance drew the attention of the rest of the household. Clara's father emerged from his study, his expression grave as he took in the scene unfolding before him. Margaret appeared at the top of the staircase, drawn by the raised voices, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as she recognized the situation developing below. And Clara herself, having heard Edmund's voice carrying up through the house despite her confinement, rushed from her room, her earlier restrictions forgotten in the urgency of the moment. She reached the top of the staircase just as Edmund glanced upward, his expression softening with visible relief the moment he saw her, followed quickly by renewed anger as he took in her pale, drawn appearance, evidence of the stress and confinement she had endured over the past week. Clara descended the stairs quickly, ignoring her mother's sharp intake of breath, ignoring Margaret's stunned expression, focused entirely on reaching Edmund and confirming that her letter had truly reached him. When she finally stood before him, Edmund reached for her hands without hesitation, his eyes searching her face with obvious concern. He asked, quietly but urgently, whether the contents of her letter had been accurate, whether her family had truly confined her and pressured her toward an unwanted match while deceiving him about the reasons for her absence. Clara, aware of her family watching the exchange with growing horror, found the courage to answer honestly, confirming every detail she had written. Lady Whitmore attempted to intervene, offering hurried explanations about misunderstandings and exaggerations, about a mother's natural concern for her daughter's well-being being misconstrued as something more sinister. Edmund turned toward her then, his expression hardening into something colder than Clara had yet witnessed from him. He addressed Lady Whitmore directly, his voice carrying clearly through the entrance hall, stating that he found her explanations difficult to reconcile with a daughter who had been confined to her room, monitored in her correspondence, and pressured toward a match she had explicitly refused. He continued, turning his attention briefly toward Clara's father, who stood silently near his study door, his expression a mixture of shame and resignation. Edmund noted, with barely restrained frustration, that a father's silence in the face of such treatment was its own form of complicity, regardless of whatever financial pressures might have motivated the family's desperate scheming. Clara's father flinched visibly at these words but offered no defense, his silence confirming what Poppy had already revealed about the family's dire circumstances. Margaret, still standing at the top of the staircase, felt the full weight of the unfolding scene settle over her with mounting dread. She understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever scheme she had hoped to salvage through her cruel rumors and manipulations had now collapsed entirely, exposed in the most public and humiliating manner possible. She descended the stairs slowly, some instinct urging her to attempt damage control, though she could not immediately determine what words might possibly repair the situation. Edmund's gaze found her as she reached the bottom step, and though his expression remained controlled, Clara could see the disappointment evident beneath his composed exterior. He addressed Margaret directly, stating that he had also become aware of the rumors she had spread regarding Clara's character following the ball, rumors designed to undermine a connection that had clearly threatened her own carefully laid plans. Margaret's face flushed deeply, torn between denial and the impossibility of convincing him otherwise given the evidence of the current confrontation. The entrance hall fell into a tense, heavy silence, as the full extent of the family's manipulation hung exposed before them all. Lady Whitmore, recognizing that further deception served no purpose, finally abandoned her forced pleasantness, her expression shifting into something closer to desperate honesty. She spoke of the family's genuine financial distress, of debts that threatened their very home, of the desperate fear that had driven her to prioritize advantageous matches over her daughter's genuine happiness. Clara listened to her mother's explanation with complicated emotions, understanding intellectually the fear that had motivated such behavior, while still feeling the deep hurt of years spent as an afterthought within her own family. She looked toward her father, silently asking whether he had anything to add to her mother's explanation, but he remained quiet, his shame evident in his downcast eyes and slumped shoulders. Edmund, observing the family's collective reckoning, turned his attention back to Clara, his expression softening as he addressed her directly, rather than continuing to confront her parents. He told her, gently but firmly, that she did not owe her family further compliance with their schemes, that she possessed the right to determine her own future regardless of the financial pressures burdening her household. He extended his hand toward her, a gesture that carried far more significance than a simple invitation to dance, and asked whether she would choose to leave with him now, to escape the confinement and manipulation that had defined so much of her life within this house. Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her, aware that accepting his offer would mean a definitive break from her family, a choice that could not easily be undone once made. She looked toward her mother, whose expression had shifted from desperate manipulation into something closer to genuine fear of losing her daughter entirely. She looked toward her father, still silent, still unwilling to advocate for her despite everything. She looked finally toward Margaret, whose earlier cruelty had caused genuine pain, though Clara recognized now the desperate fear underlying her sister's actions. None of it, she realized, changed the fundamental truth of her situation. She had spent her entire life being overlooked, dismissed, treated as less valuable than her sister, used now as a potential solution to problems she had never created. Edmund, despite the brief weeks of their acquaintance, had shown her more genuine respect and consideration than her own family had offered across years of shared history. She placed her hand in his without further hesitation, her decision made with a clarity that surprised even herself. Lady Whitmore's composure finally broke entirely at this, her earlier calculating demeanor collapsing into genuine distress, as she realized the consequences of her scheming had cost her far more than she had anticipated. She pleaded with Clara to reconsider, to understand the family's desperate circumstances, to recognize the sacrifices that had shaped her mother's difficult choices. Clara, though not unmoved by her mother's evident distress, found her resolve unshaken, understanding that sympathy for her mother's fear did not obligate her to sacrifice her own happiness and autonomy in return. Edmund guided Clara toward the door, pausing only to address her father one final time, informing him that he intended to see Clara properly settled and cared for, regardless of whatever financial arrangements the family might hope to negotiate through her connection to him. He made clear, without explicitly stating it as a threat, that any further attempts at manipulation would not be received favorably, and that Clara's well-being would remain his primary concern moving forward. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Clara glanced back once at the house that had never truly felt like home, at her family standing frozen in the entrance hall, the full weight of their scheming finally exposed and unraveled. She felt no triumph in the moment, only a quiet, steady relief at finally choosing a path that honored her own worth rather than her family's desperate calculations. Edmund helped her into his carriage, settling beside her as the door closed behind them, shutting out the tension and cruelty that had defined so much of her recent existence. As the carriage pulled away from the Whitmore estate, Clara allowed herself to finally exhale fully, the tension of the past week beginning to ease from her shoulders. Edmund reached for her hand, his expression gentle despite the intensity of the confrontation they had just left behind. He told her that she had shown remarkable courage in choosing herself over the familiar comfort of remaining within a difficult but known situation, and that he intended to ensure she never again felt the need to endure such treatment from anyone claiming to care for her. Clara, exhausted but strangely lighter than she had felt in years, allowed herself to lean slightly against his shoulder as the carriage moved steadily through the darkening countryside. She thought of the uncertain future ahead, of the scandal that would surely follow such a dramatic and public departure from her family home, of the questions and gossip that would inevitably circulate through their social circle. But beneath the uncertainty, she felt something she had rarely experienced in her life, a genuine sense of hope for what might come next, built not on desperate calculation, but on the foundation of a connection that had proven itself steady through genuine adversity. Edmund did not take Clara directly to his own estate that evening, understanding the impropriety such an arrangement would invite regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Instead, he arranged for her to stay temporarily with his aunt, Lady Eleanor Ashworth, a widowed relation known throughout society for her sharp wit and genuine kindness, who had agreed without hesitation to open her home to Clara once Edmund explained the situation in careful detail. Lady Eleanor received Clara warmly upon her arrival, offering none of the judgment or suspicion Clara had half expected given the unusual circumstances of her sudden appearance. She settled Clara into a comfortable guest room, ensuring she had everything needed for a proper night's rest, and promised that further conversation could wait until morning, when exhaustion no longer clouded clear thinking. Clara, grateful beyond words for such unexpected generosity, slept more soundly that night than she had in the entire week of her confinement. The following morning brought new challenges, as news of Clara's dramatic departure from her family home had already begun circulating through their social circle. Lady Eleanor, experienced in navigating the complexities of society's opinion, advised Clara on how best to conduct herself in the coming days, emphasizing that dignity and composure would serve her far better than defensive explanations or public confrontation with her family's version of events. Edmund called upon Lady Eleanor's residence that same morning, formally requesting a meeting with Clara to discuss the path forward. He explained that he intended to make his intentions publicly known as quickly as propriety allowed, understanding that a swift and clear declaration would help quiet the speculation already swirling around her sudden departure from her family home. Clara, though nervous about the pace of such developments, trusted his judgment, recognizing that hesitation might only invite further scandal, rather than protecting her reputation. Over the following days, Edmund arranged a series of careful social appearances designed to establish Clara's position within society, independent of her family's influence. He escorted her to a small gathering hosted by a trusted friend, where she was introduced not as the overlooked daughter of a struggling family, but as a woman he intended to marry, a declaration that immediately shifted the tone of social speculation from scandal toward genuine interest and, gradually, acceptance. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself facing consequences she had not fully anticipated when she began her campaign of rumors weeks earlier. With Edmund's public declaration of his intentions toward Clara, the earlier whispers questioning Clara's character had transformed into curiosity about what had truly transpired within the Whitmore household, and increasingly, sympathy for Clara's circumstances rather than suspicion of her motives. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated from the social circles she had once navigated with confidence, her own reputation tarnished by association with the scheming that had come to light. Clara's parents attempted several times to reach out during this period, sending letters requesting reconciliation, expressing regret for their treatment of her, though Clara noticed the requests seemed motivated as much by concern over the family's damaged reputation as by genuine remorse for her suffering. She did not respond immediately to these overtures, taking the time Lady Eleanor's household afforded her to process her feelings without the pressure of her family's immediate presence and manipulation. During this period of transition, Clara found herself growing increasingly comfortable in her new circumstances, discovering aspects of herself she had never had the freedom to explore within her family's restrictive household. Lady Eleanor encouraged her interests in reading and learning, introducing her to a small but genuine circle of friends who valued her for her own thoughts and opinions rather than her usefulness to their social ambitions. Clara began to understand, gradually, what it might feel like to be valued simply for who she was, rather than what she could provide others. Edmund visited frequently during these weeks, their courtship developing naturally now that the pressures and deceptions of her family's household no longer complicated their interactions. They spent afternoons walking through Lady Eleanor's gardens, evenings engaged in conversation that ranged from literature to their hopes for the future, each meeting deepening the genuine connection that had first sparked on that cold night outside the ballroom weeks earlier. One afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens, Edmund shared more details about the challenges he had faced since unexpectedly inheriting his title, the weight of responsibilities he had never anticipated bearing, the isolation of navigating society's expectations without the guidance he might have received had circumstances allowed for a more gradual transition into his role. Clara listened with genuine empathy, recognizing echoes of her own experience of sudden, unwanted change forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. She shared, in turn, her own hopes for the future, dreams she had never before felt safe expressing to anyone within her own family. She spoke of wanting to establish a household built on genuine partnership rather than calculated advantage, of hoping to use whatever position she might eventually hold to support causes and people who, like herself, had once been overlooked and undervalued by those who should have protected them. Edmund listened with evident admiration, recognizing in her words the same values he had come to hold dear since assuming responsibilities he had never expected to carry. As their understanding of one another deepened, Edmund began planning a formal proposal, wanting the moment to reflect the genuine partnership they had built together, rather than following the calculated formality that typically governed such arrangements within their social class. He consulted quietly with Lady Eleanor, seeking her guidance on how best to honor both propriety and the authentic connection he shared with Clara. The proposal, when it came, took place not in a grand ballroom or formal drawing room, but in the same garden where they had spent so many afternoons deepening their understanding of one another. Edmund arranged for the space to be simply but thoughtfully decorated, candles lighting the pathways as evening settled over the grounds, though he kept the gesture modest, understanding that Clara valued genuine sentiment over elaborate display. He spoke to her that evening of everything their unusual courtship had taught him, of how a chance encounter on a dark road had led him to discover a partnership he had not known he was searching for. He acknowledged the difficulties they had already faced together, her family's manipulation, society's initial suspicion, the challenges of navigating his own unexpected inheritance, and expressed his conviction that facing such obstacles together had only strengthened his certainty that she was the partner he wished to spend his life beside. Clara, overwhelmed with emotion as he knelt before her, formally requesting her hand in marriage, found herself reflecting on the distance she had traveled since that cold night outside the ballroom gates. She thought of the girl who had stood alone in the darkness, believing herself unworthy of notice or care, and marveled at how thoroughly that belief had been transformed through Edmund's steady, genuine regard. She accepted his proposal without hesitation, her answer clear and certain despite the weeks of uncertainty and upheaval that had preceded this moment. News of their engagement spread quickly through society, and this time, the reaction carried none of the earlier suspicion or scandal that had followed Clara's dramatic departure from her family home. Instead, the announcement was met with genuine celebration, society's earlier doubts replaced by admiration for a match that had proven itself resilient despite significant obstacles. Lady Eleanor hosted a small celebration to mark the occasion, inviting the modest circle of genuine friends Clara had cultivated during her weeks under her protective guidance. Clara's parents, upon receiving formal notification of the engagement, sent another letter, this time requesting permission to attend whatever wedding celebration might eventually take place, acknowledging more directly than in previous correspondence the wrongs they had committed against her. Clara considered the request carefully, discussing the matter with Edmund, who reminded her gently that the decision belonged entirely to her, that he would support whatever choice she made regarding her family's continued presence in her life. After much reflection, Clara decided to allow limited reconciliation, understanding that complete estrangement would not truly serve her own peace of mind, even if full forgiveness remained a distant and uncertain prospect. She arranged a careful formal meeting with her parents, mediated by Lady Eleanor's steady presence, during which she made clear the boundaries she expected moving forward, boundaries that prioritized genuine respect over the calculated advantage her family had previously sought from their relationship. Her father, during this meeting, offered what felt like his first genuinely honest words to her in years, acknowledging his own failure to protect her from her mother's harsh treatment and Margaret's cruelty, expressing regret that financial desperation had clouded his judgment regarding his duty as a father. Clara found his words difficult to fully trust given the years of silence that had preceded them, but she recognized the effort as a meaningful first step toward whatever limited relationship might eventually be rebuilt between them. Margaret's presence at this reconciliation meeting proved more complicated. She offered a stiff, formal apology for the rumors she had spread, though Clara sensed the words carried more calculation than genuine remorse, motivated perhaps as much by awareness of Clara's improved social position as by true regret for the pain she had caused. Clara accepted the apology with careful reserve, understanding that whatever relationship existed between them going forward would require considerable time and evidence of genuine change before deeper trust could be rebuilt. As the wedding preparations began in earnest, Clara found herself increasingly confident in her new role, no longer the overlooked, uncertain girl who had stood alone outside a ballroom weeks earlier. Edmund's steady support, combined with the genuine friendship and guidance she had found within Lady Eleanor's household, had given her a foundation of confidence she had never previously possessed. She approached the planning of their wedding celebration not with the anxious desperation that had characterized her family's earlier social calculations, but with genuine excitement for the future she was building alongside a partner who valued her authentic self. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation, fittings, and the countless small decisions required for an event of such social significance. Clara found herself grateful for Lady Eleanor's practical guidance throughout the process, appreciating the older woman's ability to balance proper social expectation with genuine warmth and encouragement. Edmund remained a steady, reassuring presence throughout, making clear at every opportunity that the elaborate preparations mattered far less to him than the simple certainty of their eventual union. As the wedding day finally approached, Clara reflected on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone in such a relatively short span of time. She thought of the desperate, humiliated girl who had walked away from Ashworth Hall that first cold night, prepared to accept a lifetime of being overlooked and undervalued by those who should have cherished her most. She marveled at how thoroughly Edmund's unexpected kindness had altered the trajectory of her entire existence, transforming her understanding of her own worth in ways she had never imagined possible. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, a welcome change from the gray skies that had hung over much of the preceding weeks. Clara woke early, unable to sleep further despite the exhaustion of the previous day's final preparations, her mind too full of anticipation to allow for rest. Lady Eleanor arrived at her room shortly after dawn, bringing with her a small breakfast tray and words of calm encouragement, understanding the mixture of excitement and nervousness that typically accompanied such a significant day. As the household staff began the careful process of preparing Clara for the ceremony, she found her thoughts drifting back repeatedly to that first cold night outside Ashworth Hall, the memory now feeling almost distant despite the relatively short span of weeks that had passed since then. She marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed, from a girl abandoned outside a ballroom to a woman preparing to marry the very duke who had rescued her from that humiliation. Her gown, carefully selected over the preceding weeks with Lady Eleanor's guidance, reflected the elegant simplicity Clara had come to value over the elaborate, fussy fashions Margaret had always favored. The soft ivory fabric caught the morning light beautifully as the final adjustments were made, and Clara found herself studying her reflection with something close to disbelief, hardly recognizing the confident, radiant woman staring back at her, compared to the uncertain girl who had once faded so easily into the background of every room she entered. News had reached the household that morning that her parents had arrived early, along with Margaret, all three now waiting in the receiving area set aside for family members attending the ceremony. Clara felt a flutter of complicated emotion at their presence, gratitude that some measure of reconciliation had been achieved, tempered by the lingering awareness of everything that had transpired between them. She resolved, as she had many times over the preceding weeks, to focus on the joy of the occasion rather than allowing old wounds to overshadow this significant new beginning. Edmund, meanwhile, had spent the morning at his own estate, surrounded by close friends and family members who had gathered to offer their support and well wishes before the ceremony. His aunt Lady Eleanor had shared with him privately, in the days leading up to the wedding, how thoroughly Clara had blossomed under the freedom and genuine care she had received since leaving her family's restrictive household, and Edmund found himself filled with quiet satisfaction at having played some part in helping her discover her own worth and confidence. The ceremony itself took place in the small chapel adjoining Ashworth Hall, the very estate where their story had first begun on that cold, fateful night. Clara found the symbolism deeply meaningful as she approached the chapel doors. understanding that the location represented not merely convenience, but a genuine acknowledgement of how far their journey together had progressed since that first unexpected meeting outside the very same gates. As she walked down the aisle, her father beside her in a role he had requested with evident humility, Clara allowed herself to fully absorb the moment, the soft light filtering through the chapel windows, the gathered guests who had come to witness this celebration of genuine partnership rather than calculated advantage. She caught sight of Edmund waiting at the altar, his expression open and warm, entirely without the careful reserve society typically demanded of such formal occasions, and she felt her earlier nervousness settle into calm certainty. The ceremony proceeded with quiet elegance, the vows exchanged carrying genuine weight given everything the couple had already faced together in the short weeks of their acquaintance. Clara spoke her promises clearly, without hesitation, understanding fully the significance of the commitment she was making, not out of desperate necessity or family calculation, but from genuine love and respect for the man who had shown her, more than anyone else in her life, what it truly meant to be valued and cherished. Following the ceremony, the wedding celebration moved to the grand ballroom of Ashworth Hall, the same room where Clara had first experienced the warmth of genuine acceptance weeks earlier. The transformation from that first uncertain evening felt profound as she entered now not as an uninvited guest rescued from humiliation, but as the newly wedded Duchess, celebrated openly by the assembled guests who had gathered to honor the occasion. Margaret approached during the reception, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of emotions that Clara had grown accustomed to reading over their years as sisters. She offered her congratulations with what seemed like genuine, if still somewhat guarded warmth, acknowledging quietly that she had spent the preceding weeks reflecting on her earlier behavior, and recognizing the depth of the wrong she had committed against her sister. Clara accepted the sentiment with cautious grace, understanding that true reconciliation would require far more time than a single wedding celebration could provide, but appreciating the genuine effort evident in her sister's words. Lady Whitmore, for her part, seemed genuinely moved by the ceremony and the evident happiness radiating from her youngest daughter, though Clara noticed her mother's attention occasionally drifting toward calculating the social advantages the family might now enjoy through their renewed connection to Clara's elevated position. Clara had long since made peace with the reality that her mother's affection would likely always carry some undertone of practical calculation, and she found she could accept this limitation without allowing it to diminish her own joy in the present celebration. As evening settled over the estate, the orchestra began the opening notes of the first dance, and Edmund led Clara toward the center of the ballroom floor, exactly as he had done weeks earlier when she had arrived as an unexpected, uninvited guest rescued from the cold. The parallel was not lost on either of them, and as they began to move together through the familiar steps of the waltz, Edmund leaned close to remind her softly that this dance, unlike their first, carried none of the uncertainty or public spectacle that had accompanied their initial meeting. He told her, as they turned slowly across the polished floor, that the first dance he had claimed weeks earlier had never been an act of charity or passing curiosity, as some in society had initially assumed, but the very moment he had recognized something extraordinary in her quiet strength and dignity, despite the humiliation she had endured that evening. He confessed that he had known, even then, that she possessed a resilience and authenticity he had rarely encountered among the carefully curated personalities typical of their social circle, and that his interest had only deepened with every subsequent conversation they shared. Clara, moved by his words, found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment, from a girl left standing alone in the cold, believing herself unworthy of genuine care or attention, to a woman surrounded by people who had come to celebrate not her family's calculated schemes, but her own authentic worth, and the genuine partnership she had built with a man who valued her precisely as she was. She told Edmund, as the dance continued, that she had never truly believed herself capable of finding such happiness, that years of being overlooked had taught her to expect little from those around her, and that his steady, unwavering kindness had fundamentally changed how she understood her own value. As the dance drew to its natural conclusion, the assembled guests applauded warmly, and Edmund drew her close for a moment before releasing her hand, his expression full of genuine affection and pride. The celebration continued long into the evening, filled with music, laughter, and the warm camaraderie of guests who had witnessed the genuine culmination of a partnership built through adversity rather than convenient calculation. Later that evening, as the celebration began winding down and guests slowly departed into the night, Clara found a quiet moment to step out onto the same terrace, where she and Edmund had shared their first true conversation weeks earlier. She stood looking out over the moonlit gardens, reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that first cold, humiliating night, Edmund joined her a few minutes later, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill, a small gesture that carried significant meaning given the circumstances of their first meeting. He asked what thoughts occupied her mind as she gazed out over the darkened gardens, and Clara admitted, with quiet honesty, that she was thinking of the girl who had once stood alone outside these very gates, uncertain whether she possessed any worth beyond what her family could extract from her presence. She told him that she no longer recognized that uncertain, overlooked girl within herself, that his steady presence and genuine regard had taught her to understand her own value independent of her family's calculations or society's fickle judgments. Edmund listened with quiet attention, then reminded her gently that she had always possessed that worth, that his role had simply been to recognize what had always been present within her, waiting for someone to finally take notice. As they stood together on the terrace, the sounds of the departing celebration fading into the quiet night around them, Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a certainty about her future that she had never previously allowed herself to imagine possible. She thought of the long road that had brought her to this moment, the years of neglect, the painful confrontations with her family, the courage it had taken to finally choose herself over familiar but harmful patterns of behavior. She understood now, standing beside Edmund in the moonlit garden, that true partnership required not grand gestures or calculated advantage, but genuine respect, steady kindness, and the willingness to see another person fully, exactly as they were, without demanding they diminish themselves to fit someone else's expectations. Edmund had offered her precisely this from their very first meeting, and she found herself endlessly grateful for the chance encounter that had transformed her understanding of what she deserved from those who claimed to care for her. As the last of the wedding guests finally departed and the grand estate settled into peaceful quiet, Clara and Edmund remained on the terrace a while longer, content simply to stand together beneath the stars, no longer strangers meeting by chance on a cold, dark road, but partners beginning a genuine life together, built on the foundation of mutual respect and authentic affection. The ballroom behind them, once the site of her deepest humiliation, had become instead the beginning of her greatest happiness, a transformation that felt, to Clara, like the truest possible ending to a story that had once seemed destined for nothing but continued disappointment and neglect. In the months that followed, Clara settled comfortably into her new role, using her position not to distance herself from those who had once overlooked her, but to extend genuine kindness toward others who found themselves similarly marginalized within their own families or social circles. She maintained a careful, evolving relationship with her parents and Margaret, one built on clearer boundaries than their previous dynamic had allowed, but one that gradually, slowly, began to heal some of the deeper wounds their earlier treatment had inflicted. Edmund continued to prove himself the steady, genuine partner he had first revealed himself to be on that cold night outside the ballroom, their marriage growing stronger through the ordinary challenges and joys of building a life together. Clara often reflected, in quiet moments, on how different her life might have looked had she simply continued walking home that night, had Edmund not stepped outside for air at precisely the moment she passed, had circumstances aligned even slightly differently to prevent their unlikely meeting. But such reflections never lingered long, replaced quickly by gratitude for the life she had actually built, one defined not by the family who had once abandoned her outside in the cold, but by the genuine partnership and self-worth she had discovered through Edmund's unwavering kindness. The girl who had once believed herself unworthy of notice had become a woman who understood, fully and completely, that she had always deserved far more than the neglect she had endured, and that true belonging came not from desperate calculation or forced acceptance, but from the genuine recognition of one's own inherent worth, finally seen and celebrated by someone who valued her exactly as she was.